Okay, hello, I'm Professor Helen Kennedy. I am Professor of Digital Society at the University of Sheffield, and I am Director of the ESRC Digital Good Network, which is hosting today's events. On the Digital Good Network, we like to give visual self-descriptions so that anyone with a visual impairment can have a mental image of us. So I'm a white woman in my 50s. I'm wearing glasses. I've got shoulder-length hair, and I have got a collection of sea life necklaces, and today's is a silver octopus. And I will invite the other speakers to give visual self-descriptions if they feel comfortable doing so. So next slide, please, Nikki. So today is a roundtable conversation, and it is hosted by the Digital Good Network. I'm going to spend a little bit of time introducing both of those things before we get going with the conversation. So the Digital Good Network is building a research community focused on the question of what does a good digital society look like and how do we get there. It's very much inspired by Rua Benjamin's invitation that we should imagine and craft the worlds we cannot live without, just as we dismantle the worlds we cannot live within. So very much acknowledging all of the harms and inequities and negative consequences of tech developments. With that in mind, what kind of digital society do we want? So we're doing this by bringing disciplines and sectors together, by supporting and funding some things we'll talk about in a minute, by providing training, hosting events like this one, and engaging in conversation with policymakers, industry folk, and communities and civil society as well. So I want to, next slide, please, Nikki. I want to say a little bit about those opportunities before we get going. Someone's saying the audio sounds unclear. Shall I lean in a bit? Is this a common problem for people, or is it a one-off? How?
I think you should
Okay,
proceed.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Great, thank you. Okay, so in a way, this event, as well as hearing from three fantastic scholars, is a way of encouraging people who are working on digital society questions from the global south to join our network, engage with us, and perhaps get involved in applying for a couple of our schemes. So we're going to highlight two of the schemes now. The first is the Digital Good Research Fund call. So can you put the next slide on, please? So each year, we invite people to apply for modest pots of money between £20,000 and £50,000 to focus on a question about what this good digital society looks like. Last year, we invited people to help us define it, like what kind of concepts form part of a definition of a good digital society. This year, we're inviting projects that help us evaluate it. How do we know when we've got some digital good in front of us? So that's the focus, the thematic focus. Can you move on to the next slide, please, Nikki? So as I've said, we're inviting calls of between £20,000 and £50,000. The deadline is the 25th of April. There's loads of resources on our fantastic website hosted by our great comms person, Nikki, who's sitting in the room with me now, to find out more about these things. And you are welcome to ask some questions about this at the end of the session if you want to. Now, I'm going to bring in Jonathan Corpus-Ong to introduce the fellowship opportunities. So Jonathan is a colleague on the Digital Good Network. He is our internationalization lead. He's Associate Professor of Global Digital Media at UMass Amherst. He's just inaugurated what sounds like a really amazing centre, the UGlow Tech Global Technology for Social Justice Lab Centre at Amherst. And he also recently co-edited a special issue of Social Media and Society on disinformation for hire as everyday digital labour. So Jonathan, feel free to do a visual self-description if you are comfortable doing so, and then please do tell everyone about our fellowships.
For sure. Thank you so much, Helen, for the introduction. Thank you to all the participants and attendees, prospective applicants to the Digital Good Fellowships. I'm Jonathan Corpus Ong. For my visual self-description, I'm a 40-year-old Asian man. I'm here in Watertown, Massachusetts. I celebrated my birthday a week ago. I'm wearing a blue and white shirt with some lucky bracelets for abundance and wealth. So speaking of wealth and lucky opportunities, I'm inviting folks to check out the Digital Good Network website, so digitalgood.net, to check out our fellowship opportunities. So the Digital Good Fellowships are available for scholars and practitioners at various stages of their career. If you're looking to incubate projects about the digital good, and they are projects engaged in themes connected with equity, sustainability, and resilience are broadly defined. You can apply for these fellowships, which will give you an opportunity to pursue original research activities, and will be prioritizing those activities that are collaborative in nature, collaborating with any of the network leadership team, as well as working with your own community partners. So it would be activities exploring what a good digital society looks like, and you'll access up to 20,000 British pounds for that. So it entails a short-term residency between 3 to 6 months in one of our network management team's institutions in the UK or US, anytime between September 2024 and June 2026. So such institutions include the University of Sheffield, which is the lead institution where Helen Kennedy is at. That includes UMass Amherst, where I'm at, but also Oxford University, Sheffield Hallam University, Lancaster University, and several media and nonprofits, including BBC Research, Elgon Social Research, and Birmingham Museums Trust. So check out some of those network leadership and also the kinds of projects we're interested in. So projects which facilitate knowledge transfer, knowledge exchange, interdisciplinary approaches would be prioritized. And I'm so honored and excited to hone in on the Digital Good from the South fellowships. So several of these fellowships will be prioritizing and focused on projects that are centering Global South experiences. So around half of the funds will be awarded to applicants who are either based in the Global South or whose proposed activities take place in or are about the Global South. So once again, this is open to academics, but also those in policy, industry, community, and civil society, broadly engaged with tech debates, digital ethics, digital rights, AI ethics, so all the fun stuff. Next slide, please. So we will be taking in expressions of interest up to April 30. And the final formal application is due late June. So once again, please check out digitalgood.net for full details. I turn it back to Helen.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for introducing that. So now we're going to move on to our featured discussion on digital good from the South. So I'm really excited, in addition to Jonathan, to welcome Payal Arora, who is Professor of Inclusive AI Cultures at Utrecht University and co-founder of FemLab, a Feminist Futures of Work initiative. I'm sure many of you here will be very familiar with Payal's fantastic work. She's a digital anthropologist and comes with 2 decades of looking at user experiences among low-income communities, especially in the Global South, to shape inclusive design and inclusive policy. She's author of award-winning books, including The Next Billion Users with Harvard Press. And I also welcome Ranjit Singh, who's a senior researcher at the Data and Society Research Lab, focused on qualitative research for the Algorithmic Impact Methods Lab. With a particular focus on research equity, Ranjit helps guide research ethics at Data and Society and develop equitable research practices internally and with external partners. He was lead organizer on the Data and Society event, Parables of AI in from the South. So a fantastic trio of speakers for our discussion, and I'm now going to hand over to Jonathan to lead that discussion. Thank you so much to all of you for being with us today.
Great. Thank you so much, Helen. And once again, so honored to be in conversation with dearly admired colleagues, Payal and Ranjit. I know of their work, not just in terms of their scholarship on the Global South, but also the community building practices and really the mentoring and opportunities that they've made available, the network building that they've been doing over the past years. So I actually won't start us off with discussing digital good like high theory, and I want us to start with the ethos that we have when it comes to community building, bridge building, and mentoring in the global media and tech space that we are in. I know we lead various research groups and labs and communities, both in our institutions in the global north, but also working with activists from home countries and elsewhere. So maybe I'd like to start with Payal to get us started. Tell us about FemLab, how it's part of your longer advocacy and trajectory as a scholar and as a maker as well.
Yes, thanks so much for having me here, and thank you for the introduction. And I'm really glad to see so many people interested in this subject. So just before I go into that, my visual description is I'm a almost 50-year-old woman. I don't want to say 50 because I'm not yet, but I feel it. Like I feel like I'm 60 anyway. And yeah, I'm an Indian woman, I'm brown, and I basically have a mass of hair on my head, which looks like a bird's nest. Anyway, so I hope that helps. But yeah, I started FemLab, in the heart of COVID. Actually, literally, I co-founded with Usha Raman in University of Hyderabad, who's a feminist media scholar and an amazing companion. I think that's part of the journey, is to find allies who you can really work deeply with in a deep kind of trust network, right? And I think that was really difficult because we had received all this funding, and particularly to do with digital ethnography for multi-years across different countries in the global south, and then the pandemic hit. And so it was also focused on particularly marginalized women workers intersecting with gig platforms. So you can imagine in some ways it was extremely challenging. We had a team of at some point 35 people spread not just across the India, Bangladesh, and Kenya, but also they were doing remote work. So we had a few institutions, but then it was spiraled by the fact that they all went back home. So we were very much reliant on Zoom, and from what I know, Ranjit also continues to have this delightful COVID life. But building community online and then of course in person is no small feat, because what we face are the larger ecosystem realities of trying to cut across not just borders, I mean, the North and South, and recognizing that, people are not, there's an equitable approach here, because a professor in the global North and a professor in the global South are different. Like my co-founder, she has to do management and doesn't get teaching exemptions from that. And she also does all that and she still writes despite it all. So in a sense, I feel like she's far more productive in that regard, right? Because to produce work, given these deep constraints and resource limits, is no small feat. So it's recognition of different systems of rewards and privileges internally. But part of the journey that Usha and I had was we really wanted to build an academic collective that not just came together intellectually, but also could move towards building something positive and, could work in a cooperative manner, right? Because I think it's a sort of offsetting, and I think it against the viciousness of academia and the toxicity and people getting really down and out, because it's a very difficult market, and it is a market, right? And we can go more into it later, but that also is like it reminds me of Eleanor Ostrom's idea of building a commons. It doesn't mean that it's a kumbaya. You have to recognize the rules of engagement. You have to understand representation. You need to hold high standards for quality. Just because you're a cooperative doesn't mean that those, get sidelined. So I think, these are just some of our experiences of the challenge of also building mentorship, is that we try to get people to work across borders, but also pay it forward. So many of our first generation experimental subjects have gone on to getting PhDs and postdocs and assistant professorships elsewhere. But I think what is challenging is to get them to give back and move it forward. And I think that culture of practice is not yet there, and we need to nurture it and to inculcate it into our wider academic climate. And I'll just pause there and, hand it over back to you, Jonathan.
Great. Thanks so much, Payal. I look to FemLab as a real inspiration in terms of how it builds connections. And I can see the many kinds of scholarship that you do that always have like a very intentional long tail to it. Like there's a policy component, there's an advocacy component, and I just want to have a brief follow-up question in terms of how, like, was that always part of your scholarly interest to make sure that there are those longer advocacy components to it, and how do you see yourself in terms of the different audiences that you're engaging with?
Yeah, absolutely. The weird thing is the way I got into academia was a by chance, actually, because of 9/11. So I used to be in a very different world. I used to be an art dealer in San Francisco and New York for many years. And I moved to New York 3 weeks after 9/11. And I was part of this massive art gallery chain and legal firm, etc. So a very different world. And I remember there was this big debate, and there was this massive research project being led by Harvard University on, trying to push against a policy that was going to be made to cut the art tax, which was to saying that, well, let's pivot it towards 9/11 reconstruction, etc. And the idea was that no, actually, even more than ever, we need the arts and media to, amplify the arts because of the PTSD component. And Harvard brought together a team of stakeholders, including that of industries, civic organizations, etc. groups. And I was one of them. So I was on the other end of research. And collaborating with that, I was like, oh my God, this really changed my perspective. And that's how I got into academia, because I was like, that's what I want to do, actually. And so that's got me into Harvard. And then the rest is history. Is like since then, every project I've worked with tends to be me being a liaison between multiple stakeholders. I don't remember a single project where I've not done that, because it's the space I'm most comfortable with, but also it's a reminder that we need to constantly work on building common ground, common language, because even within disciplines, we sometimes cannot really communicate. There's a lot of misunderstandings. And also there's a certain humility that comes with stakeholder engagement, because you don't quite know. And you need to go in understanding that you don't quite know all the pieces of the puzzle. But the most important thing is you're all committed to creating change. And I think that is something that, combined with the two, helps me personally motivate myself to doing research, because I feel like it's going somewhere. And I feel a lot of people are like me, who are not research for research's sake, which is not a bad thing in itself, by the way. I mean, I respect that too. But there's an effort now being made, particularly in these polarizing times, that we need to not go into camps, and I think that itself is a very good starting point.
Thank you, Payal. Now I'd love to turn it over to Ranjit. So Ranjit is comparatively to Payal and myself, a more junior scholar, junior in terms of age, but not in terms of brilliance. I'm a huge, huge fan. So I remember connecting with Ranjit. Obviously, he is with Data and Society, one of the leading, if not the leading, think tank in critical tech research. But it was one of the events that you facilitated and curated, the Parables of AI from the South, which was so original, which was so inspiring in how it facilitated multimodal storytelling of research, right? So using the visual medium, using essayistic forms of storytelling just to make the subject matter that we do more compelling and more artistic as well. And I wonder where that comes from, Ranjit. I think that was so brilliant, and I'd love for you to share that with our audience.
Absolutely. Very happy to be here. Hi, I'm Ranjit. I am a South Asian man in my mid-30s. I'm wearing a navy blue shirt, full sleeve shirt, and I have hazel eyes. This question of the parables is an interesting one, primarily because it kind of originates partly from the work that I was already doing at Data and Society, and partly it's a way to basically think through what community building kind of looks like. So, and as a broad distinction, and this is a really broad generalization, one of the things that I was increasingly noticing in my own exploration of how Global South scholars rationalize and articulate what it means to actually study and do the work on AI broadly, and especially thinking through the ways in which people talk about AI in general. You will see keywords such as colonialism, extraction, solidarity, dignity. And all of these terms, to a certain extent, have these common theme, which is kind of grounded more in everyday experience. How do I experience this technology? Which is distinctly different from the way in which the US and Europe scholars talk about what it means to actually talk about AI, which is firmly grounded in ideas of fairness, bias, explainability, accountability, transparency, as ideas which are fundamentally grounded in the notion that these are tools or technologies that can be designed better. So then the relationship that we are trying to draw between what does it mean to actually think about AI as a tool versus what does it mean to actually think about AI as an everyday experience was something that I was kind of experimenting with in my own work and thinking through what would it look like to actually organize an event around these questions. Now, one of the things that Data and Society does pretty well, and it is pretty well known for, is academic workshops. And there's it serves this function of gathering where people are invited to basically talk about a particular issue and submit papers to think about this work. And these are all works in progress, and how we organize them are fundamentally grounded in drawing a collection of people to basically workshop papers that we identify are useful in setting the tone for a particular topic. But when we were kind of conceptualizing this workshop on parables, one of the things that we realized was that, we would like to focus on everyday experience primarily because everybody has a story, and that allows for a much broader conception of who gets to actually tell a story about their experience of, living with AI. And in that sense, a lot of the scholarship here in this room as well has spoken to this issue of what does it mean to live with data, live with these differential notions of privacy, or Jonathan's work on ordinary ethics in humanitarian aid, and that kind of all comes together to the idea that how we express our experience with technologies is not only a matter of articulating a standpoint, but it is also a matter of telling stories that allow us to think about what is the present moment that we are living in. And that's basically the core inspiration for parables work. And that's why the formats in which we were thinking about it was audio, written stories. If you want to basically create visuals around it, you were welcome to do that. And then when we did the event, we also realized that, because we were asking our participants to do something which would ideally not be published by academic publications, we also had the responsibility of publishing this material. So generally, when we organize workshops, it's kind of based on the idea that, these are works in progress. You workshop them, you take the review, or and revise them and get it published somewhere else. But in this case, one of the first, what we eventually ended up doing was to actually put all of these stories together into one edited volume, so that there's a collection that we can actually go back to. And then to a certain extent, the other part of the challenge here is also, what does it mean to actually tell stories? And what does it mean to gather around stories? So storytelling is fundamentally a process of giving a narrative and listening to a narrative. And the idea of story slams as a fundamental way of organizing what it means to actually think about our present engagement with technologies, I think seemed to be powerful enough that it was taken on as a way to basically think about different ways of orchestrating, an exchange of experiences. So I personally think that story slams are a wonderful way of organizing some of these conversations around AI, broadly, and digital good particularly, in a way. And at the same time, it also allows for it to basically grow like ginger, in the sense that it can grow from anywhere. Anybody can organize a story slam, and that to a certain extent grounds us in a particular way of narrating our experience, which also becomes a way to think through what is our research practices, what is our standpoint, and where are we coming from. And that to a certain extent was broadly the inspiration and the idea behind putting together the Parables workshop and the work that has happened afterwards, where a lot of organizations have taken on the idea of storytelling and kind of did their own versions of it, which has been very exciting to watch and be a part of.
Thanks, Ranjit. Yeah, I'd like to invite, as a follow-up, perhaps you can retell a specific story that was particularly memorable, and the medium that they chose, and
Absolutely.
what has been the outcome of that.
So one of my favorite stories from the collection is a story written by actually a social media analyst based in Lebanon. And the premise of the story is that they were getting a lot of Facebook advertisements for migrating to Canada. And the way in which they construct the story is a very circular narrative around, they kind of go through this introspection on whether they're seeing these ads because there's something about themselves as a person and, who they are, that they are being invited to migrate to Canada. Is it something about their friends that they're affiliated with, that the network effect of basically how advertisements are shown to you? Or is it something about the Syrian refugee crisis happening around in Jordan, which actually brings up this issue, front and center to the narratives of how we experience these advertisements? And that kind of layered narrative around what just looking at an ad on Facebook kind of opens up as an area of inquiry and thinking through what it means to actually see an ad and then start to think about who else is seeing it, has been really provocative, especially, even in processes where, I've used this as an invitation to when teaching to students to think about what is it that they are seeing on their For You pages, and how is that distinct or different from what others are experiencing around them, and how our individual experiences of these technologies seem to simultaneously cohere around certain set of ideas, but also kind of represent a lot of difference. And that intersection is a really meaningful way of thinking through how we can actually start to recognize that our experience of these technologies may not be the same as other people's experiences of the same technology. And that difference allows us to basically start to theorize what it means to actually live in this world and, have to deal with AI on an everyday basis.
Great. Thank you, Ranjit. Also, just want to share some of my own community building and trust network building. I love that term, Payal. It's just an ethos that I share with these two dear colleagues about the importance of building community, that if there's no person to kind of like exchange ideas with and share those perspectives and vocabulary, that you just have no choice but to build that yourself, right? And trust people to advance and also amplify the reach of your work. So just to share that, and I think Helen had mentioned earlier that we had launched UGlow Tech Lab just last Friday at UMass Amherst, and it's very much a new lab with co-led by 3 other UMass professors, all of us international scholars, along with 7 of our grad students. And we were kind of frustrated with discussions of platform governance, also on tech ethics debates and critical tech studies that were very critical, but still coming from a very Euro-American perspective. And that how does a global perspective challenge this, right? Like what is a social justice advocacy that would truly center minoritized voices from the South? And how can we build transnational solidarity networks? So at UMass, we have such amazing critical tech scholars, but still, having that same kind of same sets of assumptions about the importance of regulation, the importance of public institutions, which are assumptions that and also resources that perhaps Global South activists don't have. And we would probably want to shade in and understand where are those divergences between a Global North centered advocacy and a Global South advocacy. And so, the kinds of questions that our lab would be engaged with would be how do states, organizations transnationally and locally counter the so-called hegemony of Silicon Valley in technology use and innovation, really understanding innovation from below, trying to understand collaboration and work collaboration from below. One of my colleagues, Seyram Avle, is an expert on Africa-China transnational labor and relationships and entrepreneurial work. So I think that's fascinating to think about. We are also thinking about social justice movements that are, looking at experiences of minority groups from the hyper-local level, but also looking at it from a transnational perspective. And again, the aim is to produce knowledge from the bottom up and foster solidarities against global digital injustices. So, think of UGlow Tech, for those of you who are also here in this webinar thinking of potential homes for your digital good fellowships. Think of us as one such potential home. You can check out our website, glowtechlab.net. So I'll stop sharing right here and move on to my next question to my dear panelists, which is the big question now of the normative and the digital good, right? So what does digital good society look like from the South? And I think both of you have authored interventions in this area, producing critiques, even critiques of the critiques, right? Like, so thinking about Ranjit's work around data colonialism, but what does that concept really travel universally? What is the analytical purchase of that concept? Maybe we can start with that, Ranjit, and you can engage that question or other interventions that you might have.
Absolutely. This is a great question, primarily because it kind of serves two functions in my head. One is how do we actually understand the theories that are coming from the Global South? What are they trying to do in the first place, and what are they trying to critique is the first question to be asked here. And especially in the context of the example of data colonialism, one of the things that struck me as I was reading that scholarship, it's fundamentally based on the idea of thinking about control, right? So if we understand data to be a relational entity, in the sense that data is an expression of relationships rather than representing something. In that sense, one of the fundamental ways in which these relationships are organized is control. And that control lends itself into extraction. It lends itself into a particular kind of way in which we are made subject to the data that we produce or that is produced about us. And within that language, we can easily see how data colonialism works as a parallel between land grab and data in one way or the other, because both of these are considered as assets. So principally, one of the things that I was trying to do with thinking about even the theorization of this work was to basically then take a step back to think about, okay, how do we actually understand the fundamental nature of data as a relational through the lens of data colonialism? And I got to the issue of control. And for me, when we start exploring the relationships embedded in data, I personally find them to be a deep combination of not only control, but also contingency, in the sense that, why data comes to represent something is a very contingent accomplishment. It happens because of a wide variety of reasons. And literally in every nation state and every, person's life, how they associate with their data is based on the contingency of what they chose to do at certain moments of time, right? So to some extent, partly, we are at the risk of basically universalizing certain kinds of experiences as being representative of how Global South experiences data. And that within that vein, I think that data colonialism is one expression of that particular universalizing experience that to some extent is true. I'm not denying that, data colonialism does not happen. I'm saying that, to some extent, there's a lot more nuance to the way in which we experience data, which goes beyond a colonial critique of how data collection practices actually works out in a way. So in that sense, partly, broadly speaking about what it means to actually think about the digital good, it's firmly grounded in the idea that, to some extent, given that data is an expression of relations, what forms of relationships do we want to embed in the kinds of practices that we are engaged in, especially when it comes to data itself, or in terms of actually understanding and researching data? So the first question, for example, which was focused on community building in the context of thinking about some of this work, is fundamentally another sort of relationship that can be developed around the way in which we think about not only data, but also how we theorize it. So to some extent, I'm inviting a broader engagement with how we think about what is the ways in which we can reshape these relationships, which are fundamentally contingent in my mind, and can be shaped, that allows us to basically reframe our relationship with data itself. And that requires community building, that requires a sort of self-expression, which is firmly grounded in not only what it means to actually be represented through data, but also what it means to claim representation through data. And the intricacies of the relationship between the two. So I find that to be a more promising enterprise of how we articulate our relationship with what it means to actually experience being a data subject. And even the term I find fascinatingly problematic, because being subject to data essentially implies that you have no agency in this process, which I still think does not apply in most of the situations, because to some extent, exercise of agency is about community building, about finding out ways and workarounds that allow us to actually move forward in a way. So primarily, the trouble that I had with some of the theorizations was fundamentally based on where are we locating the agency of computational systems vis-a-vis the people who are experiencing these systems. And the relationship between computational agency versus human agency is a fundamental question at hand that we are all kind of dealing with in diverse ways. And one way of theorizing it is to start thinking about what does it mean for us to actually think about our own agency in relation to computational systems, and what does that actually allow us to create opportunities for mechanisms to speak back, and the way by which we kind of organize ourselves in the face of these systems that clearly represent a structural intervention, which kind of seems like colonialism in a way, but at the same time can be experienced differently depending upon how we actually organize the relationship with the platforms that we interact with. So I'll leave it there, but broadly, that is how I've been thinking about these problems.
Great. Yep, great. I hear Global South scholars as particularly sensitive to descriptions or conceptual interventions around exploitation, right? And precisely trying to locate agency is something that global scholars are so sensitive about. And I think Payal's work is very much about that, like your whole trajectory, right, of, your earlier work on development and the critique of ICT4D, like development as we assume it as innately a good thing, but development according to whom and on whose terms, what's good in this situation for the farmer in India, for example, and Perhaps I'd like to invite you to think through your own discussion. How do you theorize a digital good society from outside of the West?
Yeah, so I think the key word here that you and Ranjit are bringing up again and again is about agency. And I think the climate we're in is fostering theories of impotence. If you think about it, of surveillance capitalism, data colonialism. I'll give you an example of what just happened in a conference I was keynoting last week is a woman who was working in the UN system for about 30 plus years. She's a very senior. She raised her hand and she said, I really have this burning question is, are we doing something wrong by connecting the unconnected? Because I mean, how can we do that also? I feel like it's a wrong thing for me to do, and I'm having a moral issue with doing my job. And I realize how destructive these theories can be because connectivity is a right. It is not something that the global north does for the global south, and then they feel anguished because if that's the case, they should also get off the internet. So I've been, harping on the double standards that have fostered different scholarships for different people, one for the, majority world and one for the rest of, which I'm reverting the rest of the world, which is really the elite, right? So, for example, the first 2 decades, it took me like a lot of time trying to convince aid agencies that you need to understand the leisure practices, the everyday social aspects of typical users. And they actually got personally affronted, like as if I was mocking poverty and all the seriousness of poverty, right? By trivializing it. And on the contrary, the everyday leisure practices online is the bulk of what young people do, which is 90% of young people in the world today live outside the West. So what they are driven by is to discover their sexuality and who they are, the self-actualization, connect with, find love, connect with friends, discover the world, particularly when they cannot afford to actually maybe leave their village or their town. It's so much part of becoming, right? And what we are saying is, no, we need to look at you as instrumental subjects. Just look at the discourse on leapfrogging, how young people in the global south will leapfrog and use digital media to learn math, biology, get jobs, learn English. It's all instrumentalized. And we now have data which proves that they're not some exotic beings that behave fundamentally different from you and I. They are typical teenagers who are driven by typical teenage stuff, including porn, So when we think of them as the problem is we either romanticize them as these absolute virtuous beings. When can we ever say, oh, poor people are criminals? Well, they are also, because guess what? Majority of people who are at the margins and don't have opportunities will take to illegal activities, right? Like whether it's internet romance scams or whatnot, right? I mean, and that doesn't mean that they are, supposed to be treated as deviant beings. So it's almost that we have only one frame that we can attribute for our theorizing. Are these virtuous beings or are these deviants? And, are they like taking over our jobs? Like they're these templates, and we have to subscribe to one or the other. And most of all, we leave out the agency aspect because it's all about what the global north can do and then disseminate to the rest. So build in the West, disseminate to the rest, right? And this kind of mindset also is very much infused in corporate thinking, in aid agencies. Aid agencies see them as beneficiaries, corporations see them as data points. I mean, so I have actually been, harping on that in terms of these double standards. But in my more recent work, it's been about how people look at users and get excited about it, particularly from the Western perspective, because they're like, finally, this data which we can actually utilize even to diversify our data sets to strengthen AI. But in the end of the day, you're building AI tools for whom? Right. And so I've been working in the last few years, particularly with a lot of companies, and I'm astonished by some very mundane but fundamentally destructive practices. Like, they use their research teams in the global south, we're talking about multinational companies, to research users in the global north, which doesn't make any sense, because and so then you wonder what are they doing in the global south? No, because these are data labelers, and they're the data producers. They're doing the grunt work of the data value chain at the bottom of the pyramid. And so they're not looked upon as co-creators, as people who can maybe think about design in a very different way, right? So I think these are the aspects that I've been, really pushing against. And there are so many other notions like privacy. I'm being in the European context, so obsessed about privacy, as if it is in an absolute, right, versus a relational right. As Ranjit says, it's like, it's all about relationality. Compared to what? Trade-off to, trade-off to what aspects, right? And so when people have to understand that, say if something like 2.5 billion people are living in informal settlements, and that's going to grow exponentially due to our situation of the of war, climate crisis, etc. What we have is a space where people typically live in a one-room home, multi-generations. They probably get out and most people know them, the families, their neighborhoods. There's a lot of interpersonal surveillance. And then you have the cultural norms, particularly if you're women or particular religious background, etc. Right? You're in patriarchal society, so your actual lived experiences are far more restrictive than your online experiences, which can be deeply liberating. And just to wrap this up and open back into the thing, is a student of mine was struggling because she was doing work on these marginalized communities in Vietnam and the Philippines, and she's like, I just cannot work with this data because it just doesn't fit into the surveillance capitalism theory that I really want to use, because they're way too happy about digital media and they're too optimistic about it. And I keep thinking maybe they don't get it, but they are well aware of the risks, but they feel it's still worth the chance, because this is their way of building community, taking a chance, maybe even becoming a creator and maybe monetizing and getting a little money. And so this is the problem we're in today, is we're so desperate to fit data into these beloved theories of oppression, algorithms of oppression, surveillance capitalism, and everything which tells us that the end is near, there is no point, do not connect while you're wearing your Apple Watch and you're on Twitter with your 250 followers, like 250,000 followers, bitching about the system, right? And so I think this is really the hypocrisies of really need to be underlined, but also we need to take responsibility, because we have a moral imperative to hope. And that's the point at which we need to start, because it's always, also in accounting of aspiration, of, capabilities, of like agency and tactics of playfulness and everything in between, right?
Absolutely. Thank you, Payal. I think, the focus on sociality is something that I have really taken from your work, and really understanding people's relationships, aspirations, dreams, and follies, right? Flaws, and seeing them as part of a longer story, right? They are not just the data subjects, as Ranjit had also said. And in my own work on disinformation studies, I myself am so bored of the kind of dystopia, doomsday approach of look at Facebook, look at TikTok, and we will need a legal solution to, you know, um, get the information environment healthier, as if like, it was healthy in a perfect state at some point, right? And that's why I took a completely different approach in my own work and thinking about the paid operator, right? Like who are they? And but not see them in a kind of villain, like big villain, Trump brainwashed person kind of sense, or not even in a white supremacist kind of sense. Of course, there's a space for that. But I wanted to focus on this is the worker in the Philippines. This is a worker who's doing it as a sideline job, right? Did they ever aspire to be a Duterte troll at some point in their life? Obviously not, right? But these were the conditions that brought them here. How could we support them? How could we get them out of this loop? Right? Like, how could we find better opportunities for them too, rather than paint them as, irredeemable people, but kind of seeing them in this part of longer story. And I think that, yeah, what you said about resisting those tropes is so important. And I think that's our first question here in our Q&A as well. I'd love to invite questions from our attendees now you can direct them to the entire panel or any individual speaker. You can also direct general questions about the fellowship to Helen and myself, for those who are here primarily interested about the practicalities of the Digital Good Fellowship and the funding opportunities. Please send them in the Q&A chat box. So I'd like to start by posing Malavika Raghavan's question. I hope I pronounce your name right. So picking up on Ranjit's and Payal's comments, how do you avoid fulfilling the needs and tropes of various schools of Global North scholarship when studying the South, and reconcile this with what's exciting or publishable within academia? So very challenging, provocative question of we need to be legible and fit in a certain box sometimes, like when we talk about India or the Philippines, right? How do you engage with that? Ranjit, you want to start?
Sure. I think there are two elements to this problem. One is that, there's of course a certain expectation of you need to be in conversation with certain kind of literature for you to be able to actually be legible to an academic audience. And that to a certain extent is an easier hurdle, in the sense that it involves us to take these arguments that people are making seriously and basically think through what they imply. But at the same time, part of this work is to basically reshape what this discourse is actually doing. And I think that kind of connects back to the next question on the list that we have, which is about this moral imperative to hope and how it is clearly, not doing a lot as well in the world as we live in. So partly, one of the ways in which I have been basically thinking about this problem is that, to some extent, the reason why we hope is because it allows us to basically then create scholarship that invites for a broader discussion on what it means to actually engage with these technologies and not look at them as as a dystopia in the making. So, and it's of course, on the other end, it's not utopia in the making as well. It's just happening, right? And in that moment of what is really happening, I think that answers both of these questions in terms of thinking through what are the parts of the story that we want to focus on? How do we tell the stories of the experiences that we actually encounter when we do fieldwork, right? And there are elements of the story where, for example, I have the story about, when I was doing research on Aadhaar, where, there are people in Rajasthan, in villages of Rajasthan, who basically live in the foothills where there is no network. So they have to go up a hill to basically get network, authenticate themselves and then come down again to get their rations, right? Now, this is a story that can be framed as a matter of, deep injustice, which is kind of a way by which, these systems are being, imposed on people. But it's also a story of how people are able to actually still make the system work for whatever they want to achieve, right? And I'm not saying that this is the right way of framing this problem, but the question at hand is what is the frame of thinking about what is happening when we are kind of making and managing computational agency in our everyday lives? How do we deal with that? And what does it mean for us to actually exercise our own ways of reshaping that relationship? Where are we locating the point of intervention, and where are we seeing that, these are the different ways in which we can articulate the same experience, but it allows for different kinds of interpretations, right? So I'm basically inviting a broader conversation on why our interpretive frameworks are focused more on, pessimism or dystopia, and why can't we actually start thinking through what is it that is happening in these moments that creates the conditions for us to be able to articulate what is it that we really want with these technologies and how do we achieve that. And there are moments when that happens, and and there are moments when it doesn't happen, but it's a part of everyday life in the sense that each of these different experiences are simultaneously what's happening on the ground right now. What we focus on changes the narrative of how we basically build our scholarship. And I think that to some extent that balance is deeply necessary in the way in which we articulate what's really going on and why does it matter to actually have a theory of the digital good that aligns with the way in which we think about what our agency with respect to these systems looks like.
Terrific. Thank you, Ranjit. So I just would like to collect the set of questions and then invite each of the speakers, including Helen, to address any of these questions. So a question again from Malavika. Poor people obviously would care about privacy too. Shiyab Mohammed Hanif says, does the moral imperative to hope lead us to continuously invest in hope that delivers too little in the Berlantian cruel optimism framework? There's a specific question about fellowships that are for doctoral students. There is a question about to applying for both the fellowship and the research fund, and a question about computational agency. I hope I got all of that right. Okay, so I'd like to invite short final statements from Helen. Did you want to start? Payal, Ranjit, myself.
Yes, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much. Really interested to hear everything that people have been talking about. I wish we'd set aside 2 hours for this conversation because I feel like it's getting very interesting. With that said, I am going to take the more kind of pragmatic questions. What happens within the Digital Good Network? Lots of things. We do some research ourselves. We fund some research. We encourage people to, do co-created, interdisciplinary, partnered work. So there's lots of activity because we're here to build a network. So there's lots of different things happening, and you can find out more on our website. Can you apply for the fellowship and the Digital Good Research Fund? It's important to note that the research funding application needs to be led by a UK-based university/organisation eligible for UK funding. And that's because the UK funder only gives you 80% of the money that you ask for. And UK universities are set up to suck up that loss, and sort of small-scale charities or like international organisations are less so. So that's a factor. I don't imagine that one idea would fit into both a fellowship, bucket and a funded bucket. If you get in touch with us via our email, I think we can direct you to the appropriate scheme. I think that's the way to do it. And it's not just for academics, the fellowship, it is also for professionals to take a work break and step outside their normal space. So let me hand over to the important people to say any final words.
Payal?
Yeah, all right. Just being quick. Great questions, by the way, but I see the shortage of time. So the moral imperative to hope is really speaking to those who have the privilege and the platform. And that's really important because it's those people who decide, oh, maybe I shouldn't connect the unconnected. That's really, it's that kind of mentality of breaking down, containing, looking at all of digital as toxic is not very conducive. And then the other aspect is, this is why FemLab about the privacy versus the is that FemLab takes a feminist approach, because we believe the asking of the question of, does X care about privacy or not, the global south, is a irrelevant and a really not a very useful question, because everyone cares about privacy, because we are intrinsically, it's what makes us human. It's more about also there's an element of choice, that we have the choice of privacy, and majority of the world lives in authoritarian regimes and also in our patriarchal cultures. So we have to first reveal the conditions of allowances of privacy and visibilities, and understand the tactics and navigation agencies that are embedded within it, and how can we fuel and enable those forces. I think that's a very different and feminist kind of question, which doesn't have a binary, is privacy a global south value or not, right? And I'll stop there, but a lot of very nice questions, and thank you again for this wonderful conversation.
Ranjit?
These are great questions. And the one thing that I would like to say is that question about computational agency. The way in which I think about that particular aspect is that, you have to build an entire infrastructure for a computational system to work, right? It does not work by itself. So there are people who are basically doing the work of putting together everything else so that a computational system actually does the job that it's supposed to do. And to some extent, that is what I mean by computational agency, where this entire aspect of infrastructural building that is required for computational systems to actually do the kind of work that they're imagined to do is fundamentally at stake when we actually articulate some of the ways in which we think about these technologies. So the question of infrastructure is deeply important to the way in which we think about what these systems are doing, and why they are, becoming such a crucial part of the way in which we think about our everyday lives. I'm going to stop there. Jonathan.
Great. And I guess a final statement from me, that I have enjoyed this conversation. I can see everyone typing, last minute questions, which are profound and beautiful and incredible. And I do agree with Helen that we have to have another seminar on digital good from the South. And I guess a final position of, it's important to critique the digital good in itself, right? And the notions of doing good on whose terms. People who have claimed that they're doing it for the good have come with either real profound blind spots that ended up doing more harm than good, or those who have, just been so skilled with concealing real bad intentions. And I think it's important to continually be engaged with that, in whose perspective, in whose position, and also check ourselves in the process too, right? Like when we ourselves are saying, oh, okay, we are making an intervention, we are speaking on behalf of or doing work for somebody else, but always be very reflexive about that process, and making sure that we're being checked by our colleagues. And that's why I am so thrilled to be in community with this incredible group. So thank you, everybody. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Payal, Ranjit, and Jonathan. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And yeah, let's pick this up where we're leaving off today at some point in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.